Story number 1. The Haunted Cabin. It was a crisp October evening when 3 friends, Sam, Elena, and Jake, decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The trip had been Jake's idea, inspired by an online thread about hidden cabins offering breathtaking views and complete isolation. Sam, the skeptic of the group, scoffed at the idea of spending a weekend cut off from civilization, but Elena, ever the adventurer, convinced him otherwise. After all, they needed a break from their monotonous lives in the city. The trio arrived just before dusk. The cabin was a picture of rustic charm, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. But something about the place felt off. The air was unnervingly still, and the fading light seemed to cast shadows in odd directions. Sam dismissed the creeping unease as his imagination running wild, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they unpacked their gear, Jake pulled out a camera. He had recently developed a passion for documenting their adventures and planned to film the entire weekend. "We'll make our own little travel documentary," he said, his enthusiasm contagious. They spent the evening exploring the cabin, its creaking floorboards, the stone fireplace covered in a thin layer of soot, and the dusty furniture suggesting it hadn't been used in years. By the time night fell, they were settled around the fireplace, the flickering flames casting eerie patterns on the walls. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. Elena, who had stepped outside to take a photo of the moonlit forest, rushed back inside, pale and trembling. "There's something out there," she whispered, slamming the door shut. Jake and Sam exchanged uneasy glances before following her to the window. At first, they saw nothing but the dense darkness of the woods. But then, a faint light appeared in the distance, bobbing erratically among the trees. It looked like a lantern, but the way it moved was unnatural, as if it floated rather than being carried. "It's probably a hiker," Sam said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jake, ever the thrill-seeker, grabbed his camera. "Let's check it out," he said, already heading for the door. Despite Elena's protests, Sam followed, leaving her alone in the cabin. Story number 2. The Encounter. Jake and Sam trudged through the forest, the light from Jake's camera illuminating their path. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. The floating light remained in sight, always just far enough to keep them chasing. As they approached a clearing, the light vanished. Confused, Jake scanned the area with his camera. The viewfinder displayed something the naked eye couldn't see. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in a translucent glow. It was a woman, her face obscured by long matted hair. She wore what looked like a tattered white dress, stained with dark streaks. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Sam nodded, too stunned to speak. Suddenly, the figure's head snapped up, revealing hollow black eyes. Before they could react, the camera's screen flickered, and the figure disappeared. Panic set in as the 2 men sprinted back to the cabin. They burst through the door, breathless and pale. Elena looked up from her spot by the fire, her face a mix of fear and relief. "What happened?" she demanded. Jake showed her the footage, but the camera had only recorded static. Story number 3. The Unraveling. The trio spent the rest of the night huddled together, the atmosphere in the cabin thick with dread. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside felt like an impending threat. Around 3 a.m., the sound of footsteps echoed on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped just outside the door. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, only the sound of something scraping against the wooden door. Jake, unable to resist his curiosity, aimed the camera at the door. Through the viewfinder, he saw the woman again, her hollow eyes staring back at him. She raised a skeletal hand and pointed toward the forest before vanishing once more. "She wants us to follow her," Jake whispered, his face ashen. Elena grabbed his arm, her voice sharp with fear. "We are not going anywhere. Whatever that thing is, it's not human." As dawn broke, the footsteps ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jake, determined to uncover the truth, reviewed the footage again. This time, the figure appeared clearly, her face distorted and her mouth moving as if speaking words they couldn't hear. "What does she want?" Elena wondered aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head. "Nothing good," he replied grimly. Story number 4. The Warning. Despite the horrors of the previous night, the trio decided to stay another day, rationalizing that leaving in the daylight would be safer. Elena's unease grew as she discovered strange markings carved into the wooden beams of the cabin. Symbols she didn't recognize but instinctively feared. Jake, consumed by his obsession, insisted on returning to the forest during the day. "We need to understand what's happening here," he argued. Elena vehemently opposed the idea, but Sam reluctantly agreed, believing they might find clues to appease whatever spirit haunted them. The woods felt different in daylight, though no less menacing. The towering trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches intertwined like skeletal hands. They retraced their steps to the clearing, where Jake meticulously scanned the area with his camera. This time, they found something chilling: a rusted lantern hanging from a low branch, its glass cracked and stained. Sam reached out to touch it, but as soon as his fingers brushed the metal, a sudden chill swept through the clearing. The forest fell eerily silent, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. Jake's camera flickered again, revealing the spectral figure standing just behind Sam. "Don't move," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. But Sam, sensing the presence, turned around. The ghostly woman's face was inches from his, her hollow eyes locking onto his. She opened her mouth, but instead of a scream, a low guttural growl emerged, resonating deep within their chests. Jake dropped the camera in panic, breaking the connection. The figure vanished, leaving the group shaken and desperate to leave. They raced back to the cabin, but as they approached, they saw it, a new set of carvings on the door. The symbols were now accompanied by words etched in jagged letters. "Leave or perish." Story number 5. Descent into Madness. Back inside, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The cabin seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, the walls groaning as if alive. Jake retrieved his dropped camera, finding that the footage now included garbled audio. Amid the static, a woman's voice whispered fragmented phrases. "Betrayed. Taken. Must atone." Elena began piecing the clues together, theorizing that the ghost had been wronged in life and was seeking retribution. But Sam was losing his grip, muttering about shadows moving in the corners of his vision. That night, the haunting escalated. The trio was awakened by the sound of banging on the windows, though no one was outside. Doors slammed on their own, and the temperature plummeted. Elena spotted a figure outside, pacing back and forth near the tree line. Unlike the ghostly woman, this figure was solid and wore what appeared to be old-fashioned hunting gear. Jake's camera revealed him as a man with sunken eyes and an aura of malevolence. "She's not the only one," Elena realized with horror. The cabin wasn't haunted by a single spirit, but by a tragedy that had left multiple restless souls. The man's apparition suddenly turned toward the cabin, and the banging intensified. The trio huddled together, knowing they were outnumbered and surrounded. Story number 6. The Final Night. The sun set with a haunting inevitability, casting long shadows over the clearing. Inside the cabin, Jake, Elena, and Sam gathered around the flickering fire, their nerves frayed. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to pulsate faintly, as if alive. Elena traced one of them with trembling fingers, her voice barely audible. "These markings, they're not warnings. They're bindings." Jake looked up from his camera, his face pale. "Bindings? For what?" Elena hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. "For something worse. I think these spirits aren't haunting us. They're trying to keep whatever's trapped here from escaping." A heavy silence settled over the group as the implications sank in. Sam stood abruptly, his jaw tight. "We need to leave. Now." Before they could act, a deafening crash shook the cabin. The front door splintered inward, the force throwing shards of wood across the room. In its place stood the man in hunting gear, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His presence filled the cabin with a suffocating darkness that seemed to drain the air from their lungs. Jake instinctively raised his camera, capturing the apparition in horrifying detail. The hunter stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Elena. "She's coming," he rasped, his voice like gravel. Then, with a sickening twist, he vanished into the shadows. Story number 7. The Revelation. Elena gasped, clutching her chest as a searing pain shot through her. Jake and Sam rushed to her side, but she pushed them away, her eyes wide with terror. "She's inside my head," she whispered. "I can hear her." Jake scoured the cabin for anything that could help, his desperation mounting. In a corner, he found an old leather-bound journal covered in dust. Flipping through its brittle pages, he discovered entries from the cabin's previous owner, a man named Richard Gray. The entries detailed strange occurrences. A woman named Margaret, accused of witchcraft, had been tortured and killed by a mob in the clearing. Her vengeful spirit had cursed the land, binding herself to the cabin. But Richard's final entry revealed a chilling twist. Margaret had been innocent. The true evil was the mob's leader, a hunter named Elias Ward, who had used the accusations to cover his own crimes. Margaret wasn't the villain, Jake said, his voice trembling. She was the victim. Elias was the real monster. Elena's voice took on an eerie resonance, as if layered with another's. You must free me, she said, her eyes locking onto Jake's. It wasn't her voice, but Margaret's. Story number 8. The Ritual. The journal detailed a ritual to break the curse, but it required a blood sacrifice. The three friends debated their options, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. If we don't do this, none of us will make it out alive, Elena said, her voice returning to normal but her expression grim. Jake volunteered, his resolve firm. This was my idea. If anyone's going to pay the price, it should be me. Sam and Elena argued, but Jake was adamant. The ritual required them to return to the clearing and light the lantern they had found earlier. As they stepped into the moonlit forest, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the rustling of unseen figures. At the clearing, they lit the lantern, its dim glow casting eerie shadows. Jake knelt at the center, holding a knife as the others formed a circle around him. Elena recited the incantation from the journal, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The air grew colder, and the spectral forms of Margaret and Elias appeared. Margaret's face twisted in anguish, while Elias's malevolent grin sent chills down their spines. As the incantation reached its climax, Elias lunged at Jake, his ghostly form colliding with the lantern's light. A deafening scream erupted as Margaret's spirit surged forward, engulfing Elias in a blinding light. Story number 9. The Aftermath. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. Margaret's spirit stood before them, her once tormented face now peaceful. She nodded at Elena before fading into the night, leaving only the faint scent of wildflowers. Jake collapsed, weak but alive. The trio returned to the cabin, now eerily quiet. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. As dawn broke, they packed their belongings, eager to leave the cursed place behind. As they drove away, Jake reviewed the footage on his camera. The images of Margaret and Elias were gone, replaced by static. But one frame remained. Margaret's face, serene and smiling, as if thanking them for her freedom. None of them spoke as the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the experience had changed them forever. They had confronted the darkness and survived, but they knew some scars would never fade. The footage Jake captured became a viral phenomenon, sparking debates about its authenticity. But the trio never sought fame or fortune from their story. They knew the truth of what had happened in the cabin, and understood that some things are better left in the shadows. Their lives slowly returned to normal, but late at night, when the wind howled and the shadows grew long, they couldn't help but feel a lingering presence, as if the spirits they had freed were still watching over them.